So today's interview is one that I've been very excited about. It's quite different than anything we've done before here. And actually, my guest, the interviewee, suggested this interview. And at first, I thought it was kind of odd, but then the more I thought about it, the more I thought this could be really valuable to anybody who watches it. And so, what this is a cautionary tale. This interview, this story, and this man's story is how spirituality, in at least one of its forms, can go wrong, can go really, really wrong. And I don't want to give away too much of the story, but I will tell you this gentleman is actually a professional storyteller and has been a lifelong professional storyteller as his primary vocation, which is part of what led him down this path that is going to take some very interesting twists and turns. So I would encourage you to stay tuned, and you're going to be probably very surprised where this conversation leads. I'm going to start out by just letting him tell his story in the way that it played out, and then we're going to get into a dialogue and conversation and try to maybe dissect things a little bit and kind of try to look into what the red flags might have been. And the goal of this, as with everything I do on this channel, is to really facilitate the awakening process, the so to speak spiritual journey for anyone who's authentically interested in it. And part of that is how to avoid potential pitfalls, including really big potential pitfalls that have happened in this person's life that affected not only him and his life, but many others around him in very negative ways. So that's the background of this. But I don't want to give away the details. I want him to tell his story. So I'm going to introduce to you Mac and let him tell his story.
Thank you so much, Angelo. And I, I would like to say, for starters, just to just a couple things for perhaps for some context. First, just a deep gratitude to you for what you're doing and the integrity and the wholeheartedness with which you're doing it. It's very meaningful to me. And part of why I want to say that is, there will be different people who will likely see this video, some who are obviously familiar with your channel and familiar with the content, and some who may not have seen me in 10 or 20 years and sort of are still stuck in the phase of what the hell happened to Mac Parker? What was that all about? And may not be thrilled that after going off the cliff following a spiritual teacher, I'm now on a YouTube clip talking to a different kind of spiritual teacher. So I just want to begin with my gratitude and thanks to you for what you're doing, and how beautifully you're doing it. So, and the second thing that I told you before we started recording is just that my intention is simply to, as best as possible, to reveal what happened. Um, and whatever ways that may or may not be useful to people, that's great. And so I invite your questions, or nothing is off limits in the story, or I don't need you to have kid gloves around it. And just one thing as far as people who are listening, I'm not trying to do this as I think what you say about the cautionary tale is important, but it's not necessarily so much about the cautionary tale for me as potentially, we've all made mistakes. Mine happened to be quite spectacular and devastating and hurtful to me and my family and to other people. But if there's any way that sharing, I have loved your interviews with people's awakening stories. Just they've been so meaningful to me. The beauty, the clarity, and the simplicity of them. If there's any value for people in hearing somebody who did this just about every wrong way that you could possibly do it, and am still in the process of learning from that and moving forward from that. That's part of why I I wanted to do this. So I will start briefly with, as a child, I had actually had a pretty good relationship with grace. I had lots of experiences of grace. I went to I'll just tell you a couple quick stories about that, just as background, just that this wasn't something that I had just this miserable life and so I followed some crazy man. I actually had pretty profound experiences of grace, two which I'll mention hopefully briefly. Is I was going to a pretty strict high school, and was doing very well. I was a good student, even though I didn't care about algebra and physics and all that stuff. And 2 years in, some people were starting what was called an alternative school, and I said, I'm going there because I knew that there was more freedom and more of an ability to express myself. And it was, you know, I was warned by my teachers at the time, oh, you're going to miss out. You're not going to become a doctor or a lawyer. And it didn't matter to me. I knew that even though it was not a popular decision, that was a choice I needed to make. And one of the things that happened at that school was I I wanted to be in this play Godspell. I saw it on Broadway on a theater trip, and I said I was this incredibly shy, really emotionally repressed kid, and this play was just really effusive, and the actors are going out in the audience and they're singing and they're dancing. It was totally uncharacteristic for me, and I said, I want that. I want to do that. And of course, I didn't want to just be in it. I wanted to play the part of Christ. And I never told anybody, but I practiced this record, just time and time and time again, memorizing the music. And then I came time to try out for it, and I completely fell on my face in the tryouts. I couldn't, I'm not a musician. I didn't come in at the right time and everything. And I didn't get that part. And then 9 days before the opening of the show, the guy who was cast as Christ got mononucleosis. And they said, we had a meeting, and what are we going to do? We're going to cancel the show. And I was like inside, I said, hell no, we're not canceling the show. I knew exactly what we could do. And so life just sort of handed me this opportunity to play this role, which was beyond me, but which opened doors for me that never closed again. So that was just one experience. Um, and in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. But the point I wanted to make is I had a number of these experiences of life just saying, this way, you know, go this way. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks, do this, trust me. And it wasn't like a voice of God, but it was just obvious. This is what to do. And so many things happened, but I came to this place where sort of spiritual questions were starting to come up, and I knew I don't know if I knew, but I had this sense, I don't know how to do this. I don't know anything about how to start, where to go, whatever. I actually took a TM class at about the same age you did when I first started college, but it didn't particularly light the fire for me. But around the time I guess I was about um, 30, I can't remember whether it was 30 or 40 years old, but anyway, my wife at the time had a chronic illness, and she was going to see this. She had gone to various doctors and nothing was helping, and she found this through a friend. She found the name of this spiritual healer in Connecticut.
Can I ask a question real quick? Can you just give just a minute, 1 minute long blurb on what was your vocation throughout this time, or what was your profession, or your that to me is so fascinating, like the storytelling essentially.
Well, the storytelling came later. I had a career I had come across co-counseling, reevaluation counseling, as a young man in my 20s, and this was actually the other story I was going to tell. And I just, I was this shy, repressed kid, and I found my way into this, and I realized that I had this capacity to go really deep with people really quickly and just say, for me, it was my first taste of liberation. It's just like I hadn't, experiences of releasing this stuff emotionally. And I was just like, wow, this totally changes my view of the world. So, um, so I felt the benefits of this myself. And then I said, this is what I want to do. I want to help people get out from underneath this stuff. And I would go, I would sit down with people and I didn't know anything. I had no psychological training, but I just would say, okay, if you want to be free of this stuff, what needs to come out? And I'd say, I'm not afraid of it. Let's go. And people would just pour this stuff out. So as a shy, nerdy 20 something year old kid, I had people just sort of popping with the stuff, and it was just incredibly meaningful to me. Then I hit. There was no spiritual understanding in that. There was no understanding of karma and the depths of conditioning and all this stuff that you speak to so beautifully. So I kind of hit the wall with it, and I realized there's more. There's got to be more here, and at the same time, my wife at the time, or she wasn't my wife yet, but my partner, and she was having these physical, pretty significant physical problems, chronic condition, and went had tried all kinds of doctors and heard from a friend about this guy, Dr. Lou Soterio in Connecticut. And so I knew as soon as she found it, this was just the way it was. We were going to go see him. So we went to see him, and um, she went into his office first. We both set up sessions with him, and she went into his office first, and um, I think it was a half an hour session, and she came out and she was just beaming, and I could tell that something in this had really touched on something that she needed. So then I went in, and this guy started talking to me about myself. And I had not said a word, and he was talking about my father dying and how had affected me, and what he could see. And I was lying on it was basically a chiropractic table, and I was lying on his table, and he was doing all these things. I had no idea what the hell he was doing, but he was talking to me and saying things. He wasn't asking me what my symptoms were or what my condition was. He was telling me, and he was right. And I was like, damn, what is this? And, uh, I came out and I was just like, something's going on here. And in retrospect, I can't authoritatively say that everything was absolutely accurate in what he said, or there was some element of just being dazzled. But um, it was profound. And my wife just said, "Yeah, we're coming back here," and as much as it takes. And so for 10 years, we did this. We went to see this guy, and there was nobody else involved in it. It was some combination of a spiritual guide, a therapeutic process, life coaching, everything, and it had nothing to do with anybody else. This was our process. And at that point, I had transitioned to becoming a storyteller, and I had this persona. I had grown up, was born on a farm in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and I was telling stories about farm and rural people, and it started as something that was really genuine and coming from my background, and it became more and more of, like all personas, it became more and more of an act. And so that career was going on, and I had this, I was this kind of affable farmer guy. I wore a grain hat and I told stories about hay trucks with no brakes, and just funny, serious, and it was a reflection of rural culture. And meanwhile, I was going to see this guy um, regularly who was sort of taking both my wife and I much deeper, and on a and I didn't talk to anybody about this. It was its own thing. Um, and he was very dynamic, very sharp. He was Greek. He was, muscular. He was strong. He was healthy. He was vibrant. He was confident. He was, he would just point right at. He'd call us up out of the blue and say, "No, no, you're off track here," without talking to us. He'd just call out of the blue and say, "This is going on, and you're going off track here. And if you want to do it, you can. But I'm telling you, you're going." And it was like, damn. So this was, and it has happened with both my wife and myself. So this was sort of the first 10 years of life with Lou. And, he was very dynamic. He was also, the red flags were there. He was very tyrannical. He was very sort of, well, I'm going to tell you what's true here and what to do, and you can do it if or not do it if you want, but if you don't do it, I'm gone, or you're gone. There was always that knife's edge of fear. um,
I just want to interject for a moment. For anyone listening to this, right? There is a classic recipe for a cult, and it starts with a cult leader. And number one, charismatic leader, and then number two, there's testing of your boundaries. And this is already happening. Testing of your boundaries is when they start to just get you to do things to see if you'll do it. And at first, it'll be very reasonable things. It'll be things to your benefit, and then slowly the fire the flames go higher. It's like trying to get you to do it just a little bit more. Just it's testing. It's really testing to see how and it's psychological. So there's a feedback where you start to say, well, I've gone this far. I've gone this far with this person. I have this much buy-in. I must trust them, right? You start to process it yourself, like you label this person as someone you trust, and then you don't want to break your own self-image. So they help you ease yourself over boundary after boundary, right? And I mean, I can see this already happening, and I just want to point that out for anyone who's listening.
I mean, just it's thank you, and feel free to jump in with anything you see. I'm really glad to hear it, because you're right. It would start with small things. I'm saying, well, I'm reading this book, and you say, well, why don't you try this book? And I say, well, I kind of like this book. Okay, well, you don't want to read the book I tell you to read? That's fine, you know. But the undercurrent threat was always there. And one of the hooks, I mean, there are so many things so many ways that, after working with him for 10 years, as you say, he knew me better than I knew myself. And he knew how to manipulate me. And he knew that it was important to me to be supportive to my wife. So this was really important to my wife. So are you going to be supportive to your wife and buy into this, or are you going to be a schmuck and and drag your heels and not only lose your chance at what's being offered here, but to lose hers as well? So just a lot of, I could talk for hours about that, but a lot of very insidious stuff like that. So there was a real um, perceived benefit.
What would you say to somebody who is listening at least this far and says, I'm in a situation like this with someone, whoever it could be a romantic partner, maybe, could be a boss, could be something like this even. What would you say when you start to feel your boundaries being pushed in this way, but you're still going along? Like, what advice would you give that person? How? I mean, you can't say you would have done different because you did what you did, but what advice might you give somebody?
Um, Well, I think it's very similar to advice that you often give people, which is to trust your instincts. Um, because there's a very fine line, which I think you address very well. You know, you talk about the importance of being willing to be uncomfortable, you know, and so somebody who's smart can say, oh, you're okay with being uncomfortable. Well, I'll show you uncomfortable, you know. Um, so I would say trust your instincts because there always is a knowingness, whether you acknowledge it to yourself or not. There always is a knowingness, whether it's in a relationship, as you say, in a romantic relationship or relationship with a teacher. It's just like, um, you know, there are times where I feel uncomfortable with what you teach because it kicks up something that's uncomfortable in me. But it's not because you're being an ass. It's because it's triggering something in me. So trust to answer your question, trust your instincts and be willing to be discerning about, okay, is this actually for my benefit, or is this some starting to turn into something that's manipulative?
Hmm. Good. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to, yeah, feel into that a little bit because, boundaries are, you don't have to be in an extreme situation like this is building up to know that we, on a daily basis, in some ways or another, have our boundaries challenged by people. It's going to happen to everyone. And sometimes it can be surprising when you literally just state, this is a boundary for me. Like that feels like you're unnecessarily trying to influence me for a way that I don't understand. It just feels like a boundary violation. Being that literal with language sometimes can be surprisingly effective. Um, if nothing else, this could have been a guy who was doing this with many patients, just looking for the right one, just testing people to find A, the person who can be manipulated, and B, the person who has something to get that I can get something from them if I do manipulate them. And that's how sociopaths operate. I don't know if he's a sociopath, but it sounds like he definitely has the traits. So a sociopath, that's what they do. They're just looking around for, if they have that tendency to victimize people, they're literally just testing people, looking around, waiting for the right opportunity. And if you're the kind of person that says, "Hey, that's a boundary," that's not going to work with me, they'll just say, okay, they understand. It's not going to offend them. They'll just look for someone else, sort of thing. So that's one piece of advice I would give anybody who feels like their boundaries are being violated in any way is just be willing to verbalize it even and make distance if you have to.
That's very good. I think that's good advice. The challenge of it, of course, is that this is a process of hooking you in ever more and more subtly until in the second 10 years of this, I'll talk, it became much more overt. Um, but if I had said this is a boundary, that would have been it. It's like, okay, so this is important to your wife, and you want to bail out, go ahead. You want to lose me, you want to lose your wife, go ahead. I don't care. Doesn't matter to me. And and it's tricky, Angelo, too, because the first thing this guy said, I may never know to what extent he had some authentic spiritual impulse and desire, and to what extent, there are people who think, oh, forget about it, it's all a scam, and they're, you know, you were just taken. And but I mean, we worked with this guy for years, and he would describe the purpose of his practice. He didn't talk about awakening in the same way that you do, but he would say the human body has the capacity to fully express the divine. And there are all these, not that different than what you say. There's all this conditioning, that's all this um, wounding that happens, personal, cultural, systemic, all this stuff that happens. And my practice is to help people untangle that stuff so God can express through this form. And he was. At the beginning, it was all about embracing everything. There's no feeling that gets left behind. There's no ugliness. There was a certain harshness to doing that. Sometimes he'd do it with a hammer, but there was nothing that was to be left behind. So, maybe this is one of the things that I'm still not seeing, but I honestly don't know how much of that was real and how much of that, how much he just got tangled up in his own demons and actually had some underlying true impulse.
There are certainly people out there who have significant spiritual instincts that are authentic, and when you add charisma to that, it does have effects on people. Literally, like they'll feel changes in their body. They'll feel that's a thing. There's a really good movie you should check out called Holy Hell. It's about a cult called the Buddha Field cult, and this guy is exactly this way. It started out, and you even see the film clips of it. It looks like the things he's saying. I mean, it feels pretty authentic. There's several cases of this, like Adi Da and different people, but my point really is the boundaries are the key, because once boundaries start to be crossed, it's turning into something else already. And it doesn't really matter what was authentic before, because the conditions have changed. And what happens with a sort of cult is you have the charismatic leader and then a bunch of people, but they're all sort of perpetuating the same delusion, actually, both the leader and the followers. And it's a cumulative sort of thing, and it just builds and builds, and it turns into something that it did not at all start as at all. And that's typically how this goes. And so that's why I wanted to point that out, that knowing your own boundaries and listening to that little voice that just goes, this guy's he's trying to control me. I know he's trying to control me, but he has a lot to offer. That's where the slippery slope starts. And you just got to say, hey, having your boundaries violated by anybody in any situation, if you know it's happening, it never leads to good. Even if it started as good, it doesn't lead to good. That's in my experience. So I guess that's what I would say. And I wrote a chapter in my book about. You read my book? Oh, I have a whole chapter on this, on how to avoid crazy teachers and all this stuff. So you might find that there's like some signs that line up there. Anyway, I really don't mean to interrupt your story. As for anyone watching, we talked about this ahead of time, and I said I'm gonna forget what to ask. So yeah.
No, I appreciate it. And it actually helps me sort of keep an orientation to have you chime in when and as you see um, is useful. So don't hold back in that regard on my account. And as you know better than most, that the there are lots of you can manipulate people with so-called love. You can manipulate people with spiritual principles. Um, how what he would always say is, how bad do you want this? Um, how much are you willing to give? How much are you willing to devote your life to this? And the answer was, and again, and I want to emphasize, these first 10 years, this had nothing to do with anybody but me. This was, and my partner and wife at the time. These were personal choices. It had no effect on it. And this was 10 years. And he would talk about surrender, you know, and surrender is so easy to, on some level, it's true. The ego does not want to surrender. Who the hell wants to surrender? I mean, so you can say it's not going to be comfortable to surrender, and then you've got yourself, you got more rope wrapping itself around your axle, and you start wondering why things, feel heavier and heavier.
Yeah, what you surrender to is critical. When you start surrendering to a person, you better be careful. There may be situations out there. There's the guru worship traditions in India and stuff, and there may be situations out there where the guru really has your best interest in mind. But generally speaking, I don't think that's necessary, and it has the potential for absolute disaster. So surrendering to the I am sense, perhaps surrendering to your deepest nature and being willing to continue to refine what that is, I'm all for it. Surrendering to another person or having them quote unquote help you surrender by abusing you, or undermining your autonomy, that's a different thing altogether. But hey, no one ever pulled us aside in school and told us that, right? So, uh, yeah.
Right. Well, and again, back to your question of what you would tell people. No, I mean, there were people who were skeptical, but I was not going to listen at that point. That was true. Um, and what I would say to people is you do know on some level and somewhere in yourself what is true for you and what is right for you and what isn't. You do. I did. And, I denied it for, it's very for complex reasons, but, looking back, you always know. It's always there, or it's always there to be known, at least. So, um, that's, there's more, but that's the first 10 years, you know. And the reason that I sort of point that out is this is some guy didn't come up to me and say, "Hey, why don't you start raising money to make a movie?" And I would go, "What? No, hell no, I'm not going to do that. I don't." This was somebody that um, we worked with, and in many ways knew me better than I knew myself, and that went on for 10 years. At 10 years, um, I don't want to talk a lot about, out of respect for her privacy, I don't want to talk a lot about my wife's part in this, but at 10 years, she had been, in a certain way, kind of a star pupil for him. And I was more like, I think he even said, sort of like the dog kind of running along behind the truck, trying to keep up. And at 10 years, at around uh, my wife got pregnant, and he had advised her for her well-being to not get pregnant, and so they had a falling out, and there was a pretty ugly breach in their connection, and he at this point he was kind of leaving his practice, and a lot of I never knew much about his personal life, but he turned to me and said, "Okay, if you want to keep access to these teachings, here's how you can do it, and you know you can help your wife. She's kind of gone on her own path now, but you can help her, and you can get this, and you can." Just really nasty, ugly, manipulative stuff. There was a lot of cruelty towards her, and a lot of this fear by at this point was really deeply ingrained. Sort of. Um, my father was a farmer when I was born. The farm burned. He became a preacher. He died when I was 9 years old. And that was the first kind of rent in my life. And here's this guy, that I had, all this unconscious crap with, but had hooked onto. Okay, this is my spiritual teacher. I better hang on like hell, or I'm going to lose this one too, you know. And he played that like a fiddle, and played me like a fiddle, and started asking for more money. And I was so indoctrinated that I didn't even, he once asked me for $10,000, and I didn't have $10,000. And so I went to my family and asked them if I could borrow it from them. And they were very concerned about it. And I was so indoctrinated and so clueless here that they kept saying, "Why does this guy need $10,000?" And I said, "It's not about the $10,000. This is about me stepping up to the next level of challenge." And that just kept happening. And then there was a big shift in his kind of focus and um, I don't know what you call it, path, I guess. He had been, as I said, very much about nothing left behind, every emotion, every wound, everything, it all has to be healed. It all has to be brought along. At some point, he went to Ramtha. Um, are you familiar with Ramtha? So he went to Ramtha, and we didn't know about this. We just knew he was doing something out west. He'd be gone for periods of time. And his approach very much started to change. And it became more about this, I'm not here to trash anybody, but he would talk. Ramtha is the school of the mind, manifesting, and you create God is within you, and you have that power, and you can create with us. And so it became more about that and less about this kind of more feminine. Let's bring this all along, bring this all together, um, and so at one point, he very dramatically he called me on the phone and he said, "There's a train leaving in 10 days. And if you get on that train, your life will never be the same. You will never regret it." I had no idea what this train was. But the price of a train ticket was $150,000. And so here I am. I'm this hardworking farm kid who not afraid to work, not afraid of challenges, simultaneously deeply hooked into these unconscious fears about, losing this and losing that. And, now I have a daughter and, just craziness that we could talk for weeks about. But, um, so I said, okay, I'm going to get on that train, you know? And so I raised $150,000. And I showed up to him, at his deadline and said, here's the money.
And you hadn't done anything, you hadn't done major fundraising before. It wasn't like a part of your skill set already.
No, I was a $20,000 a year kind of guy. I don't, money has never been a thing from, it's not the focus for me. I mean, everybody needs money, obviously, but I was not a financier. I was a farm kid, a preacher's kid, a country kid. I told stories. I was a pretty reasonably well-known performer, but I was a $500 a night kind of performer, not a $20,000 a night.
How does a guy like that raise $150,000 in 10 days?
Uh, it's embarrassing to even say it or shameful to even say it, but I just went to my friends and basically he had convinced me this time by this point that, see, my father died at around the age that I was when this was happening. So basically, if I didn't do this, if I didn't catch that train, I was going to die. And if I died, do you want to do that to your wife and your daughter? You know, you know, what that did to you. Do you want to, so I went to all my friends and to hundreds of people and I had made a film and I made arrangements through the local public television station that if people would donate money to the station would buy this video and then they would have access to the video and they could use it for fundraising or profits or whatever. But I basically went to people and begged and told them that I was in serious trouble and needed to do this. And I mean, it was horrible, a horrible thing to do with people. And it was the first major external where it became something that was about nobody but me, my wife, and my family to involving all kinds of people in this craziness. So then I got on this damn train, and turned out it was a plane, not a train, and we're going to Ramtha. So, here we are at Ramtha's, and I absolutely hated it. It just was not my. At that time at least it was a school for spiritual warriors, and I was not. I do more feeling heart based. It wasn't, if you have a blockage, you're gonna blow it away, and plow through or chop its head off or, and I was just like, what the hell am I doing here? Lou was there. And I went to him at some point. I said, what the hell is this? You know, you're the guy, you've been saying all along that we have to, you can't just blow away your fears. You have to befriend them. You have to heal them. You have to go in there. You have to, as you say, you have to get to the roots of these things. And all of a sudden, it was just, Ramtha is this whatever 33,000, I don't know, whatever year old warrior with a broadsword, and he's telling everybody to chop the head off whatever's in their way, and I hated it. And Lou said, I know it sounds like it's wrong, but just it's not what you think. Just keep going. You're doing great. You're the one who got us here, um, and just keep doing what you're doing. So again, I wrote a manuscript about this. There's a couple of chapters about what happened at Ramtha, um, but it's just, it was comical and tragic, all at the same time. Then this is a much longer summary than you had asked for, but
That's okay. I think it's great. It's interesting stuff for sure. Hmm.
so this is the beginning of the second 10 years where the whole tone shifted, and suddenly this was not just between me and Lou and my wife and God. This was about to involve virtually everyone I knew. So we came back home, and um, that's when I can't say planted the seed because it wasn't like planting. We were way beyond planting seeds. These sort of, what's that movie, Dark City, where they inject the stuff in your brain or something? It's just sort of like, now we're going to make a movie, and it's going to be called Birth of Innocence. And you're going to make this movie, and I'm going to, basically what he proposed was a kind of master student relationship to create a masterwork. That was the tradition. We're going to make a film about what we're learning. Um,
Did the previous film get made? Well, you were mentioning like the film that you promised people for the $150,000, like
that film was already made. Yes.
it was already made. Okay. And did people get their money back, or how did that work? That part of it.
No, they made those monies were arranged as a donation to the public television station for the. It was a very sketchy thing, and it was that film did get made. Um,
But you can see how he got the idea that you have this knack for getting money from people to for the promise of making a film.
yeah, it was the perfect fool. I was the perfect fool. And I came up with that idea on my own. He said, I don't know how you're going to do it, but I know you're going to do it. And damned if I didn't, you know? So it was a sort of, again, I was a country kid. Where I came from, if you borrowed somebody's tractor, you borrowed their tractor, you fill it with gas and you brought it back. It, it sounds a little bit corny, but it was just part of my culture. And um, it wasn't just trust, of course, it was also fear and manipulation, but it was some combination of both. So he said, we're going to make a movie and you're going to write it. You're going to write the script. You're going to you're going to keep digging in your own consciousness. You're going to come up with a script, and it's going to be an expression. It's going to be a window for people into how they can find this in themselves. Whether they do or not is up to them. But that's what this film is going to be.
It actually sounds like a really great idea, you know. I mean, as you say it, I'm like, wow, I would like to see that movie. So I can see the appeal of the idea of it at least, but
and the movie got made. I mean, um, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it was at that point it was a certain kind of relief because okay, I was a creative person. I had not made a movie, but I had never been a counselor either, and I did that. I'll do that. Yeah, cool. Um, and I had, I was quite well known in the community because I had a kind of an idealized image in the community. I was the sort of the idealized image of the farm guy, you know, trustworthy, funny, decent human being, some wisdom, a little bit of aw shucks. It was a persona, but there was some, some real qualities to it. And so I got on the phone and I said, look, I'm starting a new project and I'm raising money to do it. Would you like to invest? And I came up with interest rates and arrangements, and people, they had seen me on TV. I had narrated I had done a movie about a year-long cycle on a dairy farm that people had watched, their kids had watched 10 million times, and it was very fun and positive, and people knew me. And so they said, yeah, I'll invest. So I'd pick up the phone and I'd call somebody who knew me from a performance, and I'd say, look, I'm raising money and here's what I'm doing. They say, yeah, I'll do that. I'll invest 5,000, 10,000, 3,000. Um, and so it was easy on one level. And I was glad because I was writing contracts and I was saying this money will be repaid. And Lou repeatedly said from the beginning, don't worry about people being repaid. Everybody's going to be repaid. I promise. You just do your work. I'm doing the work in consciousness to support it. I'm going to teach you what I'm learning. Everybody's going to get their money back. Everybody's going to get a good rate of interest. Don't worry about the details. You do your job and I'll do my job. So I did. And I started, I would go for a walk in the woods or a ski in the woods, and I'd come back and sit in my little beat up old Toyota pickup, and I'd think, okay, what is this? What wants to be said? What does this movie want to be? What am I learning? What do I hear? And things would come, and so I started writing the script, and um, I kept refining it, and well, that's BS. That's and but there's something real in this. So I wrote the script, and I continued to raise money, and all the time, most of this money was going to Lou.
He was saying, "I'll manage the money for you," kind of thing, and
No, he wasn't saying he would manage the money. He was just he was basically he said, I've earned the right for this, you know, and and don't worry about it. Everybody's going to be repaid, and it's when it's the kind of thing that in a phone call with somebody you think you trust, you know, well, okay, and then 10 years later you're looking at a U.S. attorney and saying, so you raised all this money without a contract or without.
that's what I was gonna say. Did you have a company and a contract and hiring, directors and or
No, I did this on um, I had contracts, right? But I did this with I didn't even have a computer, you know. I did this, that's why we have trouble hooking up. I'm not computers are not my thing, Um, um, I literally had a clipboard, a carbon paper. I would write the contract with another contract underneath it. I'd give them the original. I'd keep the copy. So I did all this. I had a little solar calculator. I figured all the interest. I did all this, and so the first few years of that, I raised money. I was paying a good interest rate. told people I would send out periodic updates and what we were doing. And then um, about 3 years in, many parts of the story, but we started filming. So I had footage to show people. Um, I came up with a script. I jumped over that part. I came up with a script that was, it was based on what I now see as a very flawed spiritual process understanding, but it was beautiful in its own way. And people, actually, some point, maybe 3 4 years in, I had a particular connection with somebody who invested, and I said, would you like to read the script? And he read the script and he was just blown away. And he and his partner wife invested a huge, like $60,000. It's just, so there was something, and there was something really real about this. And I was talking to people, I really believed in what we were doing. And the first conversations I had with people, I was thinking, oh my God, I'm going to talk to Bauman about Birth of Innocence. I don't even know what the Birth of Innocence is. I don't know what it's going to be. I would come up with these terribly clumsy descriptions of a film that didn't even have a script yet, let alone any footage. And people would go, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's just, it's not that dissimilar from what you experience. People know that there's so much more going on, so much more to what we are. And they would just say, yes. I remember I drove down this farm road to this farm family. I just loved them. And I had never met them, but I met them and I loved them the first time I met them. It was a husband, a wife, an uncle, and a son. And they were just like this end of this back road. They had dairy cows. They didn't get out. And I was just thinking, what in the hell am I doing here? And what am I going to tell these people about Birth of Innocence? And so I'm sitting in their room, in their bedroom, in their kitchen, and I'm explaining Birth of Innocence and just feeling like a complete horse's ass and thinking they're just going to ride me out of here on a rail. And at some point, the woman said, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think this is going to be such a beautiful movie. And they all invested. So there was, in the midst of all this corruption, there was there was this kind of, I don't know if you can call it innocence because of what was surrounding it, but I really believed in what was happening. And, I had, I don't know, maybe compartmentalized enough to, or had enough blinders on to say, well, I don't understand it yet, but it'll work out. And so I just threw myself into making the film, raising the money, making damn sure people got, if somebody needed to be paid back, I paid them back. If they asked me if this was a Ponzi scheme, I would say, no, it's not a Ponzi scheme because most Ponzi schemes don't have anything at the top. There's no product. We're making a movie. Come see the movie. They come see the movie and they'd say, oh yeah, I see, okay, and they'd invest, or they'd either leave their investment in or invest more. So I would describe it as, you know, at some point, someone asked me if it was a Ponzi scheme, and I said, no, I see it more like a relay race because we are making this film, and however long it takes, we'll make it, and when it's done, we'll be done, and that will be the finish line. And if you could do the first 3 years, great. If you could do the second, whatever it takes to get there, and then everybody will be paid off in the end. Um,
So you were paying people back though with other money you had borrowed. So you kind of had this sort of snowballing effect of having to keep borrowing to keep the project going. At the same time, you were starting to make the movie,
Absolutely.
but and then Lou is siphoning off a good amount of the money you're
Yeah.
taking in.
And that's one of the dictionary definitions of a Ponzi scheme. If you're paying off investors with new money, what how I saw it or how I justified it to myself was that there is a product at the end of this, and you can see it. And, take people to the studio and show them either a segment of it or when we got a rough cut, the whole thing, and, show them we had music to it. And um, so any questions? Well, I wrote about this in the manuscript that, the first few years, this was not really that difficult, um, because I was working on a script and raising money, and it was I could keep it in one folder, and then this process went on for a full 10 years. So the longer it went, the more I was paying people back, the more folders there were, the more different kinds of arrangements, and it just sped up. It was speeding. No, we're talking, well, the actual amount of money involved was about 10 million. But what the court said was 28 million because so many people were repaid and a lot of those people reinvested. So it looked like it was more than it actually was. But the actual number was somewhere around 10 million. My restitution order is for $7.8 million. So, um, so anyway, the wheel, it just got faster and faster. And I was at one point in writing the manuscript after the fact, I felt like, I was driving a Volkswagen Bug, to start. And then, you know, I was going 80 in the Volkswagen Bug. And then the damn thing had to fly. It was just like, and I was doing all this with a pen and paper, and just no accountant, no, no nothing. Just I was determined to do everything right. So I would do 1099 forms, reporting people's interests, so that everything was done supposedly legally. And I was just trying like hell to keep up with this thing. And then, as always happens with these things, at some point I couldn't. It just, I mean, I was literally at the end, at the probably 8, 9, 10 year mark, I was working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, just no breaks, just constant. Um,
Didn't a regulator stepped in at some point with this amount of money that was moving around and actually shut it down, didn't they? Or something like that?
what happened was that, I had always been so diligent about paying people back, and then at some point I couldn't. And so somebody called the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation, a state agency that governs securities, among other things. Um, and one day, I think it was in 2008, in the fall of 2008, I got a call from the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation saying, um, what are you doing? Because it had come to their attention all of a sudden that there was a guy raising all this money from local people and they knew nothing about it. And they said, would you come in and talk to us? And I said, sure. So I,
By now, I'm guessing you knew this was basically over, and it's just a matter of what happened next, sort of thing. Or
yeah, I went downstairs to my wife and I just said, it's over, you know. And it was far from over, but it was over. Um, and they, again, many things happened, but they shut down my accounts. I couldn't repay people. I had to, I had to write a letter to against the advice. I had to hire an attorney, and I had no money to hire an attorney because all my money was whatever money I had was long since gone. But I had to come up with money to hire an attorney, and against their advice, I wrote a letter to um, everyone who had invested, telling them what had happened, and that um, I was going to do everything I could to repay them. And um, then, you know, I mean, there's so many different parts to the story, but Lou was out west. He was actually in Colorado for a time, and then he was in Washington State for a time. And I called him and I just said, look, whatever, you know, because he had always promised again and again, don't worry about the money. I've got that covered. Don't worry about it. Just keep doing what you're doing. We're almost there. And I called him and I said, look, it's over. Whatever you've been promising, it has to happen now. Because I said, you know, we've got all these people who've helped us get this far, and they need their money, and I can't give it to them. So whatever the hell you've been promising, this is it. It has to happen now. And then I started to realize, I mean, he was really not there, you know, just sort of mentally not there. And I learned, again, hundreds of things happened, but he had a few years before had a series of strokes, heart attacks and strokes, and basically fried himself. He was doing these intense disciplines that along the lines of what Ramtha taught, working with Kundalini, forcing the Kundalini up. And he had, as you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a neurologist, but as near as I can tell, just pretty much fried himself. So I kept saying, you know, I still had this kind of almost little boy like faith in this guy. Well, this is the guy who's told me to do this. He's going to come. And it just, there was nobody there. And kept saying, you got to come back. You got to come back. We got to deal with this. We got to finish this. The movie was almost done. We got to finish the movie. We got to get this done. And we got to, whatever the hell you're promising, whatever grace you're talking about, it's got to happen now. And nobody home. So he came home. He finally, I mean, his wife left, you know, and he was in the midst of this. She jumped ship, and never heard from her again. And then I finally said, look, you have to come back here now, because I've done everything you told me to do. I have trusted you, and this is it. It's over. And we gotta, you know, this is it. We gotta, whatever this is, it needs to be done now. So he drove basically nonstop from the West Coast, arrived here, and I looked at him, and he looked like a street person. You know, he looked like, or, you know, maybe somebody who was seriously strung out, or, you know, I couldn't tell. I, I, I don't know anything for sure, but I think what had happened is he had just fried himself. And he stayed in our house, and he was worthless. He had nothing, you know, there was, no, you know, this sort of bull of a guy, the dynamic, confident, muscular, was just gone. He was just a shell. And I was like, oh my God, I have done, you know, I brought everybody along on this, and the guy that I was basing this on is just, there's nobody here. I mean, he had no bowel control. He would shit his pants. He stuffed the toilet with, you know, wiping himself with paper towels, and flooded the whole house, you know, the whole basement. And my wife just said, you know, if that isn't a metaphor, you know, loose stuffs,
Right.
literally stuffs the bounty down the toilet, you know, Bounty paper towels down the toilet, and the whole basement was flooded with his shit. She just said, "Man, if that isn't a mess."
That is a tragic but pretty funny metaphor.
Yeah, it was just like, yeah. So, and I would go, you know, I'm dealing with regulators and prosecutors, and I would say, Lou, you know, what are you going to do here? You know, Are you going to come with me? Are you going to tell him? And it was just, he was an invalid, you know. Um, the dark streak wasn't gone, but he was just completely dysfunctional. So I just had this, you know, oh my God, I can't believe this. Just everything it was like trying to keep all these plates in the air and trying to pay everybody back and trying to do everything. It was just like, oh,
But there was a case being built against you, I would assume, by the prosecuting attorney or whatever. Is that right? Or is there still like people watching to go, can you really repay this? Is this
oh yeah. I mean, no, the state. I mean, there are two legal layers to it. There was a state investigation, and they shut down my finances immediately, froze my bank accounts, told me I couldn't, I couldn't access my pay accounts. I couldn't raise any more money. I couldn't pay anybody back. I couldn't do anything. Then that went on for nearly a year, and we finally settled that, and I agreed to not, they made me agree to not raise any more money again, and there were some, restrictions and penalties. And then we were just sort of getting over that. We stayed up late and watched a movie, and the next thing, the FBI was at my door, banging on the door, and I had slept late because we'd been up late. It was probably 7:30 or 8 in the morning, and a woman in a flak jacket came in to. I was in a separate bedroom from my wife, and she came in with a gun, you know, and said, "You need to get up." And I was like, "Can I get dressed?" Just. And so they raided the house. They took all the. And at this point, I had boxes and boxes of contracts and paperwork. So it took, the FBI. When the FBI raids your house, I was thinking they'll probably be back tomorrow to get me, and it was years. It took years for them to go through this paperwork, and I was able to arrange a pro a court-appointed lawyer because I had no money and could not get a job. Nobody was going to hire me, and so I got a court-appointed lawyer who was actually a very good lawyer, um, and I kept saying, well, "Why is this taking so long?" And so he would talk. He talked to it was the assistant U.S. attorney in Burlington, and they said basically they're trying to figure out whether I was a victim or a perpetrator, and it just took them, you know, years to figure out why the hell would this guy do this? I mean, because this is either just an obvious sort of garden variety scam, but there's this whole spiritual level. Is this just complete bullshit, or is there? They would look at me like, I would go in. I went in to do it's called a proffer session, where you basically agree to tell your story for a certain level of not immunity, but I forget even all the details, but it's called a proffer session, where you go in with your attorney and you just say what happened. And so I did, and these guys are just looking at me like, this guy. I mean, he looks and sounds reasonably intelligent, but God Almighty, this is the stupidest thing I ever saw. And they just you could tell they couldn't.
like they're looking for what's missing here? Like what's the key to
What
this whole thing that makes it somehow make sense, even in some
Yeah,
distorted way?
yeah, and I, all I could do is the same way I said when we began the conversation. If I had any wisdom in the process at all, it was just, okay, I've got to face this. There's no, there's no place to hide. Even if I could have gotten away, you know, because I had had such Angelo, just like the quality of the conversations you have with people when you're talking about that deepest place inside them, about them, however you would describe it. I just had hundreds of these conversations with people. I had hundreds of people who told me stories of what they'd never told anybody else, of their spiritual beliefs, of that place. Yeah, I know this is all one dimensional nonsense that I'm, this image that I'm projecting to the world. I know and so that's the way I talk to people. And it wasn't a scam for me. It wasn't, oh, if I talk to people like this, they'll give me I loved it. I loved talking to these people. I loved hearing people open up about these places within themselves. People who, many of these people were farmers. We don't talk about this stuff in Vermont. It was not, yeah, close communities, but this was just such precious, these were so precious conversations to me. And then it's just like, oh, I can't believe it. All of these people, it's just, I know what this is going to look like. And there's nothing I can do but face it, and take it on the chin. For whatever it is, if I have to go to jail, I go to jail. I have to tell people I can't. And there was a key point, in that whole victim perpetrator question. Was I going to try to, find some way that I was just, because the legal system is not about subtlety. You're either a bad guy or you're an innocent little bunny, and I just knew it wasn't either. But in that setting, all I could do was take responsibility. Just say, yep, I did that, and that was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right. But I know that was wrong, and people were mad at, they were mad at Lou because I never told you this, but one of Lou's conditions was that I not tell anybody about his involvement in the film.
You said, I loved this little quote you put in it was a summary of your book. I'm not sure what it was you sent me, but you said at the very beginning, Lou said, "No one will even know I was here," like foreboding.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just, he meant that like he's going to be the spiritual influence, and I'm going to be the creator who actually brings it into form. And afterwards, I go, oh, that's what that meant.
Yeah. Amazing. So yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to fast forward your story. I thought when the lady came with with the gun, the FBI agent, I just assumed that you were arrested and taken away, but I didn't realize that it took them this long even to sort out what had even happened and why, because the numbers that's why I kind of asked about the amounts of money and the way I did. The numbers are astronomical. For this kind of a project, it's amazing, but I can see how they were just beside themselves. Plus, having to even go through all those receipts and contracts to figure out where the money went and when it went and why it went.
Oh, and they were so convoluted. I mean, I was impeccable about keeping track of but somebody would invest $20,000 and take out the interest after 2 years and add $10,000 to the investment 6 months later. So it was a nightmare. It was just, and, they just, this, when after the raid, it wasn't just the FBI, it was the FBI, the IRS, the Vermont State Police, um, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. They left all these cards on the kitchen table, and what the hell was the Department of Homeland Security doing? It was like, it was,
They never tell you that part. When your house gets raided, they all leave their cards.
yeah, yeah, they all leave their cards. It was just, my daughter is, they said they don't want us getting up, and so we're sitting at the kitchen table, and my daughter, how old would she have been at that point? I don't know, maybe 7 or 8. They all had bulletproof vests on. So my daughter looked at my wife and said, "Mom, why are they all wearing floaties?" She was just a very, very curious about everything. So,
Innocent. And then, so then at some point, this became you were convicted of. What were you convicted of specifically?
um, well, um, just to back up a little bit, I had to make that choice of whether I was going to, there's a thing called a folie à deux. It's a French term. Basically, it means shared delusion. You know, um, two people agreeing on something crazy and reinforcing it, and that was one potential defense, and various, and I just decided. Um, I actually had a conversation with an old friend of mine. I had taught her co-counseling many years ago. I don't know if you know Jeannie Zandy, but she has her own uh, practice now, and she was very helpful to me. And um, she said, I, I said, I'm just really trying to figure out what to do here. And as I've told you before, I already knew, but I said, and she just confirmed it. She said, you know, if there's something you need to take responsibility, she said, my experience is that if there's something you need to take responsibility for and you try to run away from it, it'll just chase you all the rest of your life. And so I just said, okay, I'm going to plead guilty to this. What I did was wrong. I didn't tell people, even though I didn't tell people because Lou told me not to tell people. It was wrong to invite investments from people and not tell them the whole story. And so I pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 55 months in um, Raybrook Federal Correctional Institution near Saranac Lake, New York, Lake Placid area. Um, and showed up there in September of 2013. Um, and there were some documentary filmmakers who are now actually, I've just been talking to them. They're sort of about to take the next step in completing a documentary, but they were filming me the night before and the morning of going to prison. Um, so I went to prison and I was there for 4 years. And because it was, even though I've never worn a white collar, this was supposedly white collar crime. I was sentenced to a minimum security, or what they call camps, but there are no. They sent me to a medium. Um, it's technically there's one unit that's a minimum security, but it's within the fences of a medium security, and so just a tremendous education for me, basically, and frankly, a kind of relief because the insanity had gone on uh, on some level for 25 years, pretty intensely for about 15. The 10 years of raising the money and then the 5 years of all the legal stuff, and then I was just in prison. And when you're in prison, you're a bad guy, and nobody expects you to be anything other than a bad guy, and you can't talk to people on the outside, and you just sit there and you do whatever you do. So I just said, okay, this is going to be my monastery, or whatever, my place to face what I did.
What did you spend your time doing in prison? Did you sit in meditation and
So
contemplation, and or did you read spiritual books or?
all of that, yeah. Um, a very dear friend of mine, um, who had who was also kind of a spiritual counselor, but a really, really lovely, decent guy named Don DiMercurio, had helped me, basically gave me free sessions in the whole time before I went to prison. But in prison, he sent me Adyashanti's book, The End of Your World, um, which was just perfect. I mean, great book, great title for when you're in prison, because um, it uh, it was. and I just and I mean, it's a train wreck of a story. Obviously, it was a a lot of harm was done to a lot of people, and I would be I had a bunkmate for the first 6 months that I was in prison, and I would just be there. I would be lying in my bunk or just in the cell, and I would just go, "Oh God," just like that. And he'd go, "What? What?" I had these thoughts of these conversations that I'd had with people, just where I had so naively, foolishly, stupidly, whatever you want to call it, um, invited people into this whole thing and called forth this very vulnerable and deep parts of themselves, and then it just all. I mean, it was just horrible.
One question I have at this point is what when the movie I saw online that the movie actually finally got made, and there was an editor. I saw a sort of bit of an interview with an editor who you knew already, and then at some point he described when you kind of told him what was happening or when he found out what was happening, and he just thought, "What in the heck is this?" But he also felt committed to finish it at some point, and he did. If I'm getting this right, now was that when you were in prison or is that afterward?
Um, that's a whole long story, but that was before I went to prison. He was someone that I hired him after the footage was shot, and we already had a rough cut of the film. And I think I don't. It's a tricky story, and it's a tricky story for me to get into. But he kind of took it upon himself that he was going to take over the film, and there was some sketchiness about it, frankly, and there was some um, Dudley Do Right, I'll pay the rent kind of thing um, that happened with that. The film was basically finished. He did some the the finishing touches on it and put it out, but he and a group of investors actually, this was a subplot, actually forced put me into involuntary bankruptcy so that he could gain control of the film.
So basically the monies from that's what I was getting at was any income that this film makes, does it go back to the original people who invested in it, or
It went through the bankruptcy court, and I don't even, I had to defend myself in bankruptcy court, which was like an absolute joke, because I don't know anything about bankruptcy law. So the money would go, if there is any money from the film, it would be distributed through the bankruptcy court. But I have a separate restitution order with the federal courts. I mean, the legal system is so bizarre because there's two separate, there's a bankruptcy court resolution of it, and then there's a federal restitution order. I am required to pay 10% of my, and I pay 10% of my gross income towards restitution every month. So, and I tried sort of, in a way, kind of frantically to come up with other creative projects that might earn money, and it just, absolutely, none of it. Life was just saying, no, it's not gonna. You're not gonna.
were you happy with the final product when you finally saw it?
I have not seen it.
You haven't seen it.
No, it's it was a terrible process, and it's I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it either. I'm interested to see it, but I wanted to wait till I talked to you first, actually. But I want to watch it. I saw like a trailer that looked intriguing, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think probably it's better just for me not to not to talk specifically about that at this point.
no, that's okay. No worries. I was just curious. because obviously the whole thing sort of centered around that movie, and um, yeah, so
I think unless you have a specific question, there's one other thing that I'd like to say, which is that part of why I asked you if we could do this, have this conversation, is um, I reacted to one of your, or commented on one of your posts about how not to waste time in the spiritual process. And I was just like, if anybody wasted time in the spiritual process and made a mess of things, it's me. So but what I've experienced, this is not to, it's important for me to say how deeply sorry I am to the people that I hurt and to the trust, for the trust that was violated, because that was profound. And, I'll live with that as far as I can tell for the rest of my life. Um, and that's not something I ever forget. At the same time, sort of self-flagellation runs its course, at least hopefully it does. And you know, I realize that this became a kind of forest fire that consumed my life and kind of left me with nothing, and on a certain level, which in a bizarre way was the whole point to begin with, and so what I'm trying to communicate in a clumsy way is that yes, it's a train wreck. Yes, there are things for people to watch out for. Yes, there's knowledge that you and others have about how this manipulation works. And we all do make mistakes. We make mistakes in relationships. We make mistakes with our children. We make mistakes with our own inner integrity. And what I am trying to communicate is that there's a place in facing that you can get to a place where that stripping away happens. And I mean, there were times in prison where I was like, oh, I actually feel better than I ever have, you know? And again, not to minimize the effects of what I did, but it's just like all this, this persona, the stage persona, the personal persona, the identity, the conditioning. It just, what I described it was like a forest fire. And I was in the middle of it, and there was no way out, and it was going to burn me up, and all I could do was surrender to that. And, here I am talking to you, for crying out loud. It's just, that's what a blessing, and that's, that's what it took for me. And if there's any encouragement I can offer people, that if you're willing to face, I mean, you talk about shadow work, man, this is, it doesn't get much darker or more shadowy than this, just really hideously dark stuff. And and what I've learned is, in retrospect, anything that I had maintained, if I had, God forbid, if I had succeeded with this film, what a pompous ass I would have been, arrogant, more dangerous than I was already. And the stripping away is sort of like, okay, here is, not that it's a finished product or anything, but here is getting down to what's real, and that is always available to us, whatever we've done. And the kind of spiritual awakening that you're bringing to people, the wider that lane can be for people who've really screwed things up. Not just, oh, I got mad at my kid one day and I feel like such a schmuck for that. It's like, yeah, that all happens. I'm talking about doing serious damage to a whole culture, a whole, and lots of individual people. Can there still be, it's like, to me, learning to accept the unacceptable, learning to love what's really unlovable. Just, oh, you know, can you really, when the forest fire burns everything down, there's no shade. It's like you are exposed. And I just know, I know from experience all the things that I hid under a successful career and a successful persona, and they're gone. And all those things have had to be exposed. And it doesn't mean that that revealing and that exposing is done. But I guess if I could look eye to eye and to someone and say, if you've really screwed things up, just look at it. Just take responsibility for it. Retrace what in you allowed that to happen, and you can find your way to tremendous freedom on a really, really convoluted path.
I love it. I recently did a video about kind of pointing out that there's no demographic of people, age, gender that can't wake up and so forth. And one of them is people who have done time, people in prison. There's Kenny Johnson has some really good videos, but there's a wonderful video I like to share on occasion. It's just an interview someone did of him in Bali, but he woke up in prison, and in an amazing way, really, and he describes it so beautifully. I'll link these on this video actually. The other one is John Sherman was actually on the FBI 10 most wanted list at one point. He was in prison when he woke up, and so I really believe that there's no one that's irredeemable. When it comes to realization, it doesn't. Your past does not matter. It matters in the fact that you're going to do the shadow work, but it doesn't matter in the fact that your true nature is your true nature, and it's accessible right now, right here, regardless of what you've been through, what others have put you through, how much trauma you've had, whether you've had a great life, whether you've had a really miserable life. Those really don't factor in to you coming in contact with your true nature. Your intention does. That's what factors in, and you're a great example of that. So I appreciate your time with all this, and I know that was probably I don't know how many umpteenth time you've told this story, but hopefully you told it in a little different way, and we dug in a little bit that in ways that can help others.
Yeah, well, as I said to you, I've told it to prosecutors and lawyers and people who are important in my life, but I've never told it to somebody who has the sort of the quality of attention and experience that you do. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Very,
Yeah, thank you so much.
thank you. I appreciate it, Angel. I appreciate everything you do. And I appreciate the sincerity of the people who comment on your videos. And, it's a beautiful reflection on the power and the clarity and the sincerity of the work that you do. And I hope that, as I say, that maybe this can create a little more space around even one other person's serious mistakes or difficulties. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.